Hi, yes, my name is Steve Sanderson. I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET team. Recently I've been working on a NuGet package called MVC scaffolding, and the idea of this package is to reduce the difficulty of getting started when you create a new ASP.NET MVC project. And for newcomers, the benefits are fairly obvious because when you get started and you've got a blank slate, it's not necessarily clear where to go. And for reasonably experienced developers, the benefits are also fairly significant. I'm going to just skip the introduction and jump ahead. You've already seen a little bit of scaffolding demonstrated by Phil Hack in the last session. He showed you a very straightforward CRUD scenario. So the idea of this next hour is to dive very deep into what MVC scaffolding does and show you its application in a range of different scenarios and show you how we can do things like customize the templates that it renders and the logic that it renders and show how you could use it for a whole bunch of different things on your project. So I'm going to get started with an ASP.NET MVC3 project. This is a very basic starting point because I've got nothing in my application apart from this single home controller, which has got pretty much nothing in it, just renders an index view. And I've got a few model classes in my models folder, such as this one for a car here, which has just got a primary key and a couple of properties. And as you saw before, you can scaffold a basic data entry UI by saying scaffold controller, and then I'll give the name of my model, or the name of the controller, it's the same thing, and MVC scaffolding will go ahead and create a bunch of files for me. And when it's done that, I'm going to quickly walk through those the files that have come out there, and you'll see that firstly I've got a controller called cars controller, and it references a data context, which is how Entity Framework gives me access to a database, and I've got a bunch of simple action methods for delete, create, edit and so on. And they don't do anything very complicated, they just take some incoming data and they just push it into the database. And also I've got a set of views to match these actions. For example, I've got an index view here that renders an HTML table referencing all the properties on my car. And also I've got things like edit, which internally calls a partial called create or edit, since create and edit are very similar concepts. And if you look in there, you'll see that it's created a little block of HTML for each of the properties on my model, apart from the primary key, because it knows that you don't want to let the user enter a primary key. Okay, now hopefully I can build this and actually run it. So if I go to the URL cars, which is what you do to get to the cars controller, then it should pop up a really simple data entry screen, and I can create some cars, like I can have a Ford Mondeo. I don't know if you have Mondeos outside the UK, but we do here in England. I used to have one, it's a decent car. And then let's say I have a look at my database. You'll see that automatically Entity Framework has created me a database with a schema to match the model that I just scaffolded. And you'll see that I've got a table called cars with columns for each of the properties, like make, model, and so on. And if you look very closely, you'll see that these columns are currently nullable. That is, they can hold null because I didn't say that the properties were required. So if I decide that I do want them to be required, I can stick a bit of extra metadata on there, like that, required. That's a standard data annotations metadata. And if I try to rerun now, we'll actually get an error message. It will say that the model has changed. So the database no longer reflects the state of the model because I've just changed some metadata about it, and it doesn't really have a way to proceed. Now, hopefully we'll get a more slick automatic way of dealing with this at some point in the future, but right now you have to deal with this a little bit manually. So I'm going to go into the context class, which was generated for me, and this represents my connection to the database. I'm going to uncomment this line here, which is a way of configuring Entity Framework code first to say that if the model changes and you don't know what to do, then you have my permission just to drop the database and recreate it. It's pretty catastrophic, but it gives us a clean way of proceeding with development. Now, of course, you wouldn't do this with your production data, you're not intended to, but as a way of doing development reasonably quickly, it's convenient. So with that line of code there now, when I reload, it will hopefully not give me the error this time, but will instead bring back up this screen and I can go ahead and start creating stuff again. And if I look at my schema in the database now, you'll see that this time, if I look at the columns, they're marked as not null this time. So Entity Framework will respect the metadata that we're using. Okay, right, so let's review this code that we've got here a little bit. You'll see that we're directly coupling this code at the moment to this data context class, which is directly coupled to Entity Framework, and that's okay in simple cases, but in a more sophisticated application, or if you wanted to do things like unit testing, it would be nice to have a bit more abstraction than that and not to couple the controller directly to the data access layer. And so the standard design pattern to deal with that is called repository. And that means that we just define something which is an abstract representation of our data, and then we talk to it through that. And I can do that with scaffolding very easily by saying I'll pass this flag called repository to this controller scaffolder, and that will go ahead and it will say, okay, I've added this repository, but I didn't want to overwrite any of the other files, so it skipped everything else. That's not exactly what we want in this case, because we want it to actually get rid of everything and do things with the repository. So I pass the force parameter and it will overwrite all these files. And now you'll see that my car's controller, it no longer has a context reference directly, but instead it references an instance of iCar repository, which is an interface that describes my data access layer. And you'll see that all of the actions no longer talk to Entity Framework directly, but they only speak to this car repository. And I'll have a look at the car repository itself. You'll see that that is fairly straightforward. It's kind of representation of a database. It's just got methods for getting things, deleting, updating, and saving changes. And you could create an implementation of that using any database you like, any data access layer. You could use a non-relational database or JSON web services or anything that stores data. But out of the box, we provide an Entity Framework implementation of that. And that just contains roughly the same logic as we had before. It's got a bit of clever code to deal with eager fetching, which I'll explain in a minute, but apart from that it's pretty simple. Anyway, if I compile that and reload, then it should all just work exactly the same, and I can start putting some data in. Like I'll say I'll put in a Toyota Prius from 2006, and that gets saved. I don't have the Mondeo because that'll get wiped out when the database schema changed, but anyway, I could put that back in if I wanted. Ford, Mondeo, and there we go, it's all working okay. And now we don't have this direct coupling, and we could unit test if we wanted by passing a mock car repository into our controller if we felt like it. Alright, so that's very simple scaffolding with using a repository. So just to review what we're actually going to do in this talk, I will show you that we've just covered the very basic case, and I want to move on quickly to dealing with relationships, because in the real world data is always related to other data, and we've got to have a way of dealing with that. And MVC scaffolding has got some built-in support for one-to-many relationships, which is probably the most common thing that you need to deal with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another entity called person, and I will say that cars can be owned by people. So a person has many cars. That's the relationship I want to model now. So firstly, I'm just going to create myself a standard data entry UI for person in the same way that I created one for car, just by issuing the scaffold controller command against that. And that will go away and it will create me a person controller, well, effectively people controller because it's pluralized. And it will behave just the same as before. It's got its own repository and so on. Now, there are a few different ways of defining relationships between entities, and I'll show you the simplest one first. And I can go to my car model and say that a car is owned by a person by putting a property on my car called person ID. That's it. Okay. Now, because that ends with ID and starts with something that looks like an entity, both MVC scaffolding and Entity Framework understand that there's a relationship there. So just by having that there, I could rescaffold the person user interface. No, let's say this rescaffold car, and we'll see what comes out of that when I've done that. So let's say I want to create myself a new car now. Ooh, got myself a nice little error message there. And the reason for this is that I've not actually bothered to rescaffold things properly. So let's get that right this time. And rebuild, and hopefully this time I won't have an error message. Okay, so now when I'm creating a car, you'll see that the scaffolding has produced a drop-down list, and I'll just actually use that and then I'll show you the code behind it. So before I can proceed with creating a car now, I have to create a person. So I'll go to the people controller and I'll create Steve. Okay, and then if I wanted to create a car, now in my drop-down list, I can choose Steve. So I'll add to my list there. And if I go back into that, you'll see that Steve is automatically chosen because we've remembered that. And I can't remove that relationship because it's a required field, because the property, person ID, is not nullable, so it's got to have some value. Okay. Now, how does that work? Well, it's not very complex. If I go into Cars Controller now, you'll see that the scaffolder has made references to two different repositories now because they're both required. And when we are, let's say, creating a car, it automatically passes a list of all the possible people to the view there by querying the person repository. And in the create view for cars, you'll see that as well as the normal blocks of HTML for each of the properties, down at the bottom we've got this drop-down list which is going to let us choose the person. Okay, so this is not magic, it's something you could have done yourself quite easily, but it just saves you some time and saves you the trouble of figuring out how to do it. But I want to improve this slightly because right now, when I'm on this list of cars, I'd like to know who each car belongs to, and it's not telling me that, and even if I go into details, it still doesn't tell me. And also on the list of people, it's not telling me anything about the cars owned by those people. And the reason it's not telling me about any of this stuff is because I don't have any properties to hold that information. And if I wanted to, I can expand my model a little bit to give it an extra property, public virtual person. Okay, so if I've got a property called person, then this is going to match up with this relationship here, and this property will automatically be populated by querying for the person with that ID. And the reason it's marked virtual is so that EF can lazy load that property. And similarly, if I wanted each person to know about the list of cars that are owned by that person, I can add another virtual property there of type iCollection, because it's multiple, a collection of cars called cars. Okay, and just by having those two properties there, if I rescaffold things now, and obviously that's going to wipe out any changes I made to the code, so you really want to do this stuff up front and not later after you've started editing things. Although there are ways with scaffolding of just updating existing classes that I'll talk about later. What's the other thing? Is car. So when I have rescaffolded all this, then the user interface will give us a little bit more information. I'll show you it first and then I'll show you the code. If I reload my people, then this time, again the data's been wiped out, but we've now got a cars column there, and if I go back to the list of people, the list of cars, I've now got a person column, so I could actually start populating this data a little bit. I'll put Steve back in, and I'll create another person as well, called Boris, let's say. I've got two people, and they've both got no cars yet, and I could create a car, and I'll put this Prius back in again, and I'll assign that to me, and then you'll see that on the screen we now know that the person who owns this car is Steve, and if I go back and refresh the list of people, you'll see that Steve has 1 cars and Boris has none, and I could edit this and reassign the car from Steve to Boris. Say I've sold the car to Boris, and if I reload here, then you'll see that Boris has now got that 1 car and Steve does not. Alright, so very basic relations all working together as they should, and if you want to see how that actually works, well, behind the scenes, the code we've generated there, when we wanted to generate a list of cars, we needed to also get for each car the person, and so this syntax here tells us to eager load the people that are associated with each car. If we didn't have that, then Entity Framework's lazy loading would still make it work, but what would happen is that as the cars table was being rendered, for each row it would have to do another database query to fetch the name of the person to go into that column there. And we don't want to do that because that would cause performance issues, so scaffolding automatically eager loads all of the relations that are going to be involved in the table for efficiency, and it's still, for all the other actions like create and edit, it's going to pass all the people to the views so that they can show up. And if you look at the views, like I'll look at the view for cars, you'll see that we've got this column called person, and here it's saying if there is a person associated with this car, then I want to display their name, otherwise I'll display none. And you might be wondering, how did it know to display the person's name? And why didn't it, for example, display their email address instead? And the answer to that is that there's a convention. Basically, it goes looking for properties with certain names that look like they're good names to summarize the object. So name is one of them, subject, title, things like that. If it can find a property with one of those names, it will use that. And if it can't, it just falls back on trying to pick the first property. And if you don't like what it comes up with, you can just change it. Like, let's say I want to display the email address of the person instead of the person's name. And obviously I can do that just by editing the code. Or you can edit the template to change the conventions that it uses, and I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, so that's simple relations. Now I'm going to do a more advanced kind of relation. Currently I've just shown you how to define relations by naming convention. So by having a property called person ID, that defines a relation with an entity called person. But what if I wanted to have multiple relations with an entity? I couldn't use the same property name multiple times. Or what if I wanted a person to be related to another person? Well, I can't create another property called person ID, I've already got one. So we need a slightly different syntax. And I'll show you how that works right now. Let's say that I want to, in my model, say that each person is related to a manager who is also a person. And I can do that by creating a new property called manager ID. Okay, now because that ends with ID, it might describe a relation with an entity called manager, but there isn't one. And in any case, I'm going to override that by creating another property of type person called manager. Okay, and to enable lazy loading, I'm going to mark it as virtual. And also, so that entity framework understands this relation properly, I have to give a little bit more metadata to say that this property is related to a foreign key called manager ID. Okay, now I appreciate that convention is not necessarily obvious until you've actually seen it, but now you have seen it, you see that you can create as many different relations as you like with arbitrary names to arbitrary entities. In this case, I've got a relation from person to person called manager. Okay, and now I've got that. If I was to rescaffold the person user interface, then what that will do is effectively create for me a hierarchy of people. And if I look at the editor for person now, no, I want the create or edit partial, then you'll see I can choose a person to be associated with each person. So here I want to, I'll reload this, and it's going to have wiped out my data because obviously I've changed the model metadata information there. And let's say I want to create a new person. I'll try to create Steve again. There we go. And I've got a manager, and I can choose from the available people, which currently is nobody. So I can't choose a manager yet, and that's a bit of a problem because it's a required field. So I will solve that by saying that, in fact, the manager relation is optional by turning this int into a nullable int, making it optional there. I'll rebuild that, and now I should be able to actually save that data into the database. And there we go. You'll see that Steve is there with no manager. I could create Boris again and pick the manager. And there we go. We've got the existing people, and we can choose Steve if we want to. And now you'll see that Boris's manager is Steve, and Steve has no manager. And I can do quirky things like, you know, say Steve's manager is Boris and Boris's manager is Steve. And it's all a bit weird. But anyway, that's just how a one-to-many relationship works, and you can go and put in other custom domain logic if you want in your controllers to say what sort of values are acceptable. Okay, so that covers what I want to cover about relationships. I've shown how you can set up very simple relations just by putting a property called person ID or car ID or something like that. I've also shown how you can display that information in the tables and edit screens by creating a property to hold the referenced object. And I've also shown how you can create arbitrary numbers of relationships with arbitrary names by using a slightly different naming convention. Okay, so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on ways that we can customize what scaffolding does. We're going to move on a little bit from the standard CRUD scenarios, which are very nice, but the power of this system is really in that you can make it do other things. And certainly one of the things that you can do is customize the templates that it renders. Internally, to generate the code, it mainly renders T4 templates, which is a simple templating language. And if you want to see exactly what it's doing, I'm going to rerun the person scaffolder, and I'm going to pass this extra parameter called verbose. And if I do that, it's going to give me a bit more information about what's going on behind the scenes there. So when that's done, it tells me that it's been looking for a whole bunch of different templates in order to render this. Like it was looking for a template called index, one called controller with repository, and all sorts of things, and it tells me where it found them. And as soon as I know the names of these templates that it's rendering, I can customize them. The way I can customize them is by running another scaffolder command. So scaffold custom template, and then I say, for the view scaffolder, I want to customize the index template. That's this thing here. And if I issue that command, then what that does is it adds a new file to my project in a folder called code templates that it's just created, scaffolders, the name of the scaffolder. Now this will look a bit unfamiliar, but I'm going to explain this in a minute, but just ignore it for now. And inside here, I have got the T4 template that the scaffolder is trying to render. And it can look a little bit scary at first because you don't get any kind of syntax highlighting in Visual Studio for T4 templates right now. But here it is. You can see that it uses arbitrary C# code to do things like iterate over all the properties on my model so that it can produce table columns for each of the properties. And it displays the view name there. It's producing some Razor code, and down at the bottom we've got a whole bunch of standard code that describes the ways that we can find what properties are on our models, and you can customize that if you want to do some strange things yourself. For example, you could change the set of standard properties that it goes looking for when it wants to display things in a grid. As I mentioned before, it goes looking for things called name and title and so on, and if you want to customize that list, you can edit that here. Anyway, simply having this file here inside our project means that if I was to rerun the controller scaffolder, when it goes looking for the index view, it will actually use my template instead of the standard one. So if you look closely here, you'll see that it's actually found the thing that's inside my code templates folder instead of inside the MVC scaffolding folder. So I can edit that if I want. Like, let's say I want at the bottom of my tables to display the number of items in the table. So I can just put a bit of extra code, total, and then I'll say model.count. This is Razor code, items. Okay, and now that's there. If I want to rescaffold again, then the code that I've entered into my custom template will appear inside the generated view. I'll reload that, and I'll look inside, which one was it? Person, the person index view, down at the bottom of the table. You'll see that the total items thing that I just wrote has now appeared because it's respecting my custom template. And if I reload this, you will see that it actually does display the number of items. So now anytime anybody scaffolds a controller within my project, it's going to display the number of items at the bottom of the list. And you can customize that in other ways. For example, you can write arbitrary logic and you can get access to all sorts of information like the set of all the properties, which ones are primary keys, which ones are foreign keys, all this kind of stuff, and put your own logic in there to describe how you want to deal with that. Okay. So that's very simple customization. And what I want to do really is move on to talk about doing some more advanced customization. Not just modifying an existing template, but changing the logic completely, in fact providing something completely new. But before we can do that, I have to explain to you a little bit about what scaffolders actually are. I've been using the word scaffolder many times in this talk so far, but I've never really said what I mean by that. And to define that a little bit more clearly, I shall explain that a scaffolder is something that plugs in to the NuGet command called scaffold. And the thing that plugs in there can have its own logic, it can have its own template, and it can invoke other scaffolders as well. And that sounds a little bit abstract, so I'm going to try and just show you in more detail. So when I call scaffold and press tab there for the tab completion, this has given me a list of all the scaffolders that it can find. Some of these have got familiar names like controller, and some of them have got crazy looking names like this. But an easier way of seeing what we've got there is to enter the get scaffolder command. And what that does is it finds the list of all the things that are plugging into the scaffold command right now and gives me information about them. And you'll see that each of them have got very long, unambiguous names like this one, mvcconfstevesanderson, or mvcconfstevesanderson, and that's to ensure that they don't clash with any other scaffolders, even though they might have similar purposes. Like I've got two different things that produce views here. I've got an ASPX view scaffolder and a razor view scaffolder, so they need to have different names. And over here you can see that scaffolders can live in NuGet packages, and these ones all do, because these all come out of the box. But they don't actually have to be in packages, because you can just create custom ones that live in your project as well, and I'll do that in a minute. Now, if I wanted to render a view, I could invoke this ASPX view scaffolder directly if I wanted. I could say scaffold mvcconfstevesanderson.aspx view, typing the whole thing out, and then I'll say for the home controller I want to add some view. And that will go away and it will create a view called SomeView for the home controller, and this is an ASPX view because I just rendered the ASPX view scaffolder, and that's fine. But you probably don't want to always be writing this sort of long thing out all the time. You might want to just say scaffold view. Now you can do that as well, and if I do that, you'll see that this time it's created a CS.html file, which is a razor view. And there you go, you see I've got this view here, razor view. And you might think at this point, like, what is all this crazy magic? How does it know to render a razor view when I just say view? Basically, what's going on here? And I can explain that if I run a command called getDefaultScaffolder. And what this illustrates is that there is a concept called defaults, and a default is just a shortcut name that resolves into a long name for a scaffolder. So currently the name view resolves to MVC scaffolding razor view, which means that saying scaffold view is the same as saying scaffold MVC scaffolding.razor view. And partly that's nice in that it saves us time typing it out, but the real benefit of this is that when scaffolders call each other, they don't know what your preferences are. Like if the controller scaffolder wants to render a view, which it doesn't know whether to render an ASPX view or a razor view, but it doesn't have to know because it just says scaffold view, and then whichever thing you've configured to be the default for view is the thing that will get rendered. And if I want to change the thing that's the default, I can use the setDefaultScaffolder command. So let's say I want to set the default scaffolder for view to be mvcconfstevesanderson.aspx view. There we go. And now if I run getDefaultScaffolder, you'll see that view is now associated with ASPX view, which means that if I say scaffold view without saying what type of view I want to use, it will try to create an ASPX view. In this case, that file already exists, so it's going to skip it. But nonetheless, it was trying to do an ASPX view. Okay, so that's very useful as a way of defining what things that you want to have by default. For example, you could create a scaffolder called, let's say, nhibernate repository, and then assign that to be the default for repository. And then whenever you try to call scaffold controller, behind the scenes, it's going to call your nhibernate repository scaffolder. And that's the way that you can hook into different points in the scaffolding process and customize what it actually does. And in case you're wondering how it chooses what the default view type is between ASPX view and razor view, well, this happens when you first install the MVC scaffolding package. It inspects your project and tries to decide whether it appears that you're using Razor views or SPX views just by looking at the files that are already there, and chooses a default view automatically. So whichever one you're using, hopefully if you say scaffold view, it's going to pick the right one. And if it doesn't, then you can use this default scaffolder command to change it. All right, so that's what a scaffolder actually is. It's something with a name that we can find, and it's got its own logic, and it can be given a default name, which gives us a shortcut way of finding it. And all of this information is going to be becoming very useful just now, because I'm going to move on to the most advanced part of this talk, where we look at creating an entirely new custom scaffolder. Okay, so we've just looked at choosing scaffolders, and there we go. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a custom scaffolder that is going to, for my purposes, replace the normal controller scaffolder and produce a different controller that renders an Ajax-powered grid. And that's just an alternative to the normal HTML-centric way of doing create, edit, delete, and so on. And the way I'm going to do this is, firstly, instead of actually creating a custom scaffolder up front, I'm going to start by creating an example of an Ajax-powered grid, just so that we all understand how the grid actually works. And once I've got that, I'm then going to create a custom scaffolder and generalize the code I've already got from the example implementation into a template that I can reuse with other model types. Okay, so bear with me a little bit as I sort of go a little bit off-road and start talking about Ajax grids and not about MVC scaffolding for a few minutes. Okay, I want to create an Ajax-powered grid for a model of type, let's say, I'm going to do product. It's another model that I've got here already. You can see it's just got a few simple properties, very basic, plain CLR object. And if I wanted, I could create a controller that edits instance of these. And I'm not going to use scaffolding, because I'm going to do something a little bit different to the normal controller. I'm just going to create my own controller. Add a controller, and I'll call it products controller. And as you can see, by default, that just renders a view. And I will try running that firstly. Products. And initially I don't have any view, so it's going to give me an error message. And I can use the normal add view if I want, but just to show you, I can also do this through scaffolding. Let's just make sure that I set my default view back to Razor before I confuse myself too much. And then I can say scaffold view products index. That's just a command line alternative to doing add view here. And if I look inside my products controller now, I've got this index view. And if I try to reload, you'll see it will just display a blank screen, which is nice. And I want to put my Ajax-powered grid on here. And I'm going to use a component called ch9, which is based on jQuery, and it fetches a set of records using Ajax, and it's also got built-in functionality to do create, edit, and delete as well, which will become useful. And I'm not going to explain in too much detail how ch9 works. Some of you may have used it before, some of you may not. It's not very obvious, but anyway, you can figure it out by reading the documentation for that tool. And basically, I've already prepared the code that I want for ch9 here. I'm just going to drop that in, and I'll quickly run you through what it does. So if I go up to the top here, this is the start of my view. And I've got a couple of HTML elements, one to represent the actual table itself, and another one to represent the paging controls. And then I'm using jQuery to grab that table up at the top there and say, use the ch9 plugin to produce an Ajax grid. And when you need to fetch some data, I want you to fetch it from an action called get grid data. The data is going to come back in JSON format. You need to respect the primary key, which is called product ID. There are a bunch of columns that I want to display for each of the properties. There should be 5 rows per page. Link it to this other pager element, some information about the size that I want. And then finally, there's a little bit of configuration for the pager that says which features I want to enable. Like I don't want to enable searching, but I do want to enable edit, create, delete, and I've got some other options for those. Like when you want to actually send the edit data, send it to this action. When you want to do a delete, do it to this action, and so on. Okay, now if you've used ch9 before, you'll recognise that. If you haven't, well, you won't. It's not very obvious, but anyway, it should work, hopefully. If I reload this now, it's going to hopefully display for me my grid. It's got the 2 columns that I want, but it's not got any data. And in fact, if I bring up Firebug here and look at the requests that have just happened, you'll see that there was a 404 not found when it tried to invoke an action called grid data. And that makes sense because I've told it that I want it to fetch data from grid data, but in my controller there is no such action. So I need to implement that action, and you don't want to watch me type this out, so I've already prepared that. It's not too complex. Basically, it gets the page number and the number of rows passed in from the AJAX request, and it's going to go looking in the database context to try and get the right data and send that all back in JSON format. So pretty simple stuff there. And currently it won't compile because I haven't got this context variable, so I'm just going to drop that in at the top. So there we go, that's my scaffolding demo context that I created earlier. It doesn't have a products on my context just yet. If you look at my context right now, it only references people and cars. But I can run another scaffolding command to say scaffold db context product and db context type. I want to add a reference to product to this particular context. There you go. You'll see that it's edited the existing class without wiping out the class information that was already there. So that's a nice thing that you can do. And now I should be able to build the code, and I will run it. And this time I've still got no data because there's no data in my database, but there was not a 404 this time. It actually successfully fetched no data. All right, let's say I want to add a new record. This is a feature built into ch9. It will produce this little form based on the columns in the grid, and I can say let's add, I don't know, chicken, price 50, and if I try to submit that, I'll initially get a 404 not found, and if I look at Firebug, you'll see it tried to post to an action called create, which again makes sense because in my view I said that when you want to create, you post to an action called create, but there is no such action. So again, I'm going to have to create the action, and similarly for edit and delete, I'm just going to drop all these things in. They're very, very simple. You see that my create action just grabs the data from the incoming request, the model binder turns it into a product instance, and we just stick it into the database using this context object. Similarly for edit, we just have to tell Entity Framework that the data that you've been received should be treated as modified and therefore update existing data, and delete, we just tell it to remove that item. Okay, so now those things are there, hopefully I could resubmit that request, and this time it would actually go through, and you'll see chicken appears in the grid. I could put something else, I don't know, fish, 3.5, okay, that's fine. And that all works, and just to show you that paging works, I'm going to add a bunch more records. Apologies that this is a little bit boring, but I just need to get more than 5 records. Okay, and there we go. Now you'll see that paging works as well. And there we go, we've got our Ajax powered grid. We can edit stuff and we can delete things if we want. So I'll delete B, there we go. That all works very nicely. What I want to do though, instead of just having a hard-coded Ajax grid that's customized to work with product, is to create a custom scaffolder that generates these Ajax grids for me on the fly for any model type. And that will save me a lot of time during the course of my development process. The way to create a custom scaffolder is to use a scaffolder. This gets a little bit meta and Inception-like at this point, but there is a scaffolder called Custom Scaffolder, which scaffolds scaffolders. Okay, and all I have to do is give a name, and I'll give it a nicely long, unambiguous name, Steve Scaffolders.ajax grid, let's say, because maybe at some point I'm going to put it into a package called Steve Scaffolders. And what that does is it creates a folder inside my code templates folder with that name, and it's put inside there a PS1 file, which is PowerShell logic, and that describes the logic that my scaffolder is going to run, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And it's also put a T4 template, and that's an example of some output that I could produce. So by default it's just produced a sort of stub C# class, and if I go back to the PowerShell logic, What it's doing there is that it is showing you how you can find a template on disk and then render that, passing a little bit of information, like it's passing this example value into the template and adding that into the project. I'm not going to explain this code because we're not even going to use it. So if you're unfamiliar with PowerShell, don't worry about the fact that you can't understand that. But just to show you this actually working, if I was to try to run this now, you'll see that my scaffolder appears in the tab completion list. I can say run that and it will immediately create something called example output. If I look at that file that's just appeared in my project, example output, you'll see that it looks very similar to this T4 template. That's the template, that's the output. The difference being that it's actually injected some information that's come from the PowerShell file. Okay, so that's a very simple starting point for creating your own scaffolder, but I'm actually not going to use very much of this logic. I'm just going to wipe all of that stuff out. Okay, because what I really want to do, instead of having that custom logic, is that I want to just call the existing controller scaffolder from my custom scaffolder and get it to use a different template instead, a template that produces an Ajax grid. Okay, to get started, I'm going to put in a bit of description here. So I'll say, let's say, generates an Ajax-powered grid. Okay, and let's just check that we can find the scaffolder. So if I call get scaffolder, you'll see that my scaffolder appears in this list and my description's there, and it's not associated with any package because it's just in my project. And let's say I want to give that a nice convenient short name, so I can say set default scaffolder. I'll come up with some new name, so let's call it grid, and I want to assign that name to my Ajax grid. And now if I wanted, I could invoke that just by saying scaffold grid, and it does nothing because I've just deleted all the logic. So the first bit of customization I want to put into my custom scaffolder is a parameter that takes the name of the model type that we want to generate a grid for, because it might be a grid for a product, or it might be a grid for person or something else, and we need a way of passing that information into the scaffolder. And if you're familiar with PowerShell, and I appreciate many of you may not be, the syntax for defining parameters looks like this. You don't need all of this parameter stuff with the mandatory and value from pipeline if it's an optional parameter, but I'm saying that it's a mandatory parameter by setting up all this metadata, and it's called model type. And now because that's there, if I try to re-render scaffold grid, this time it won't let me do it because it will say no, there's a new mandatory parameter called model type and you didn't provide one. So if I provided one, I can either give it as a named parameter like that, which appears in tab completion, or I can just type in directly, like, what is it, product is the type of model I want to scaffold, and that's not doing anything yet because I don't have any logic. But the logic I want is to render the existing scaffolder controller and render that with a different template. And I've got a bit of logic I've already prepared here. What this is going to do is, just like you could call scaffold mvcconfstevesanderson.controller from the NuGet command line, you can also call that from inside your scaffolding logic. And I want to call that, I'm passing along the model type that we've been given, I'm passing along other parameters like the project, the code language, whether or not we want to forcibly override things. And I'm also passing a couple of other parameters. No child items is a way of telling the controller scaffolder not to generate things like views and repositories, because we don't want it to produce all the index, edit, delete views, because those are not relevant for an Ajax grid. And also I can pass this override template folders parameter and tell it to fetch the template folders, not from wherever the normal controller templates are, but from wherever the templates are for this particular scaffolder. And the framework passes that into us using this parameter. So if I try to run that again now, you'll see that this time it tried to call the products controller scaffolder, and because its file was already on disk, it didn't do anything. And if I run it with the verbose parameter, you'll see that it found a template called controller with context that it wanted to render. Now I want to override that, and all I have to do to override that is to have a template with the same name. So I'm going to rename this, this simple template that came automatically to controller with context. And now if I was to rerun that again, you see this time it tried to use my template instead of the default one. It tried to use this, you see. And so I can start putting custom logic in there. And what I want is to put some T4 script in that produces something that looks as similar as possible to this products controller. And I don't really have time to step through the whole process of doing that, so I'm going to drop in a convenient starting point for myself, which I've got here. And so what I've got here is a T4 template that looks very similar to the normal controller with context template, except that I've taken out almost everything from the controller. The only thing that I've kept in there right now is the database context thing at the top. And I've got these useful variables that I'm going to be able to use to produce the output that I want. So what I want is to produce something that looks as similar as possible to all this. So I'm going to copy and paste all of this stuff and drop that in here. Okay, and I now want to generalize it. I want to remove all the hard-coded references to products. So instead of products, I want to have model name plural, like that. And I will replace every reference to products with this. So that one can go, and that one can go, and are there any others? That one as well. Okay, so there are no more references to products plural. I want to eliminate all the references to products singular as well, like this. And I will replace all of them. I don't want any hard-coded references. That might be all of them. And I want to replace the reference to the primary key using other information that gets passed in, model.primary key, like that. And I also want to overwrite all of these variables called product with the model in lowercase, which I've got in this thing here called model variable. So once again, replace all the words product with this. That might be everything. I'll just search for product to check that I've got them all. It looks like I have. Okay, right, so now I've got my template there. I'll try rerunning this yet again. And this time I want to forcibly overwrite what we had before. So product controller has now been regenerated and it's almost working. The only thing that's not working is that we've got context with an underscore here and context without one here. So I'll just fix my template a little bit. I put an underscore there. Rerun that yet again. And this time looks like, oh, one more thing I have to do is I have to put a using system.data. I'm going to put that into my template as well, so that I don't have to keep remembering to do this. I can go here, rerun it for a third time, and this time my code actually builds. Okay, so I've been able to generate the controller there, and if I rerun the thing that I've just compiled, hopefully it will still work as before, and indeed it does appear to. I also want to scaffold the view. So you'll remember that I just earlier on created this view here with all this JQ grid stuff in it, and I want to generate this automatically now. So I'll go back to my PowerShell logic there and say that as well as rendering a controller, I also want you to render a razor view. So that's saying scaffold, MVC scaffolding razor view, and I'll pass to it a controller name, which I'm going to get by pluralizing the model type that you've asked for. And I'll say that we want to render a template called Ajax Editor View, which doesn't exist yet, passing on a bunch of other parameters like the project that you want it to go into, the code language, and so on. Again, I'm overriding the template folders, basically just doing what I did before. And if I rerun this now, you'll see that this time it'll fail because it's gone looking for a template with this name, which I don't have. So I'm going to have to create a template with that name, and I will get that by copying and pasting the existing index template there, rename it to, what's it called, Ajax Editor View. Okay, now go in there, and once again there's a whole bunch of T4 stuff, and to save time I'm not going to bother actually doing this by hand, but I will just copy and paste an implementation of that. So I will, getting a little bit lost here, delete all of this stuff that produces the traditional table. And there we go, we are now producing all of this JQ grid logic using a template. So we're respecting things like the primary key name, we're iterating over all the properties in our model to produce the col model thing, and basically, hopefully that is going to produce the right view that we want. So if I run this again, yet again, this time I'll forcibly override the index view. And you can see that we've overwritten the view that we had before with the scaffolded output. And hopefully, if I rerun it, it will still work. And it does appear to. All right, now that was a lot of work. And the good news is that now we've done that once, we can churn out Ajax grids for other things very easily. And to prove that, I'm going to create a tiny brand new model and produce an Ajax grid for it in just a few seconds. So I'll create a new model called company, and I will drop in a little bit, a few properties here. The only thing I'm doing that's unusual here is instead of using the normal ID convention to define a primary key, I'm using some metadata just to prove that that works as well. Apart from that, it's just, simple properties. Also bear in mind that currently my controllers rely on the assumption that there is a property on the context for the model type, and there isn't by default, so I'm going to have to put a little bit more logic into my PowerShell file here to automatically call the DB context scaffolder so that whatever model type you want to scaffold automatically gets added to the repository. Okay, now I'm going to run this and hopefully we will get an Ajax grid for company without having to do any other work. So I'll say scaffold grid company, and away it goes doing its thing, and it looks pretty good. It's created a company's controller which looks like it's about right. It's producing all this JQ grid type stuff with the grid data there, and if I look in views, I've got company's view, and this looks about right too, because that's got the column model for all the properties on our company. If I actually try running it, go to companies, then it has apparently successfully returned no data, which is what we wanted, so I can start populating this. Very valuable stock, that. And then indeed it has worked. And let's have something else. And there we go. I can do things like delete and edit. And I've created an Ajax grid from my scaffolder in just a few seconds. So just to review what the scaffolder is, it's this folder here. It's got my PowerShell logic that is calling other scaffolders, and I've got some T4 templates that define the kind of output that I want. And if you wanted to redistribute this, you could put this folder inside a NuGet package, and that's really all that's required. Simply by installing that package, someone else would then get access to your Ajax grid scaffolder. And if you wanted, inside your package, you could also put other things, other content, like the JavaScript that's needed to power JQ grid, this file here, JQ grid, and CSS and so on that's associated with that. And then it would be a fully self-contained package that somebody could just install and create Ajax grids in a few seconds. So that would be very nice. So I am looking forward to seeing what the community does with this and what ideas you can come up with things for scaffolding. All right, now that covers all the stuff that I wanted to cover. So I'm going to have a quick look and see what Q&A have appeared and see if I can answer any questions. I've got about 3 minutes. Okay, so the first question is, for the majority of what is being generated, the logic could be generated in an abstract class and overridden in scenarios where it needs to be different. Well, that is true, but if you want to put in a lot of custom logic, then you need a place to put that custom logic. So if you do have an object-oriented way of inheriting a standard repository and doing everything by inheritance like that, that's very nice. But really what's coming out of scaffolding is relatively simple code that you would probably want to customize a lot yourself, and that becomes quite messy if you're trying to do it through inheritance. Okay. If both res and ASPX used in a project, how would you handle them? Well, if that was the case, you couldn't say scaffold view, or you could, but it would just use whatever the default is. If you wanted to specify arbitrarily which one you wanted, you'd have to say scaffold res view or scaffold ASPX view, and then it would use whichever one you've just said. Is pagination client or server side? Well, with JQ Grid, it is server side, because it's doing an AJAX request and it's telling us which page number we want, and then that's going into the iQueryable and it's just pulling out the right data. Apologies to Steve M for the screen not refreshing fast enough. Yep, I heard that too. Will scaffolding work with standard EF update model from DB without code first? The answer is yes, because really all we're doing there is just referencing plain CLR objects. So if you've used the database first model, then you will have generated some model classes and you can scaffold against those, and that will be absolutely fine. There's no problem with that. How do you switch from SQL Express to SQL Server? This is that's a question about Entity Framework code first, really, rather than about scaffolding. And the answer to that is that by default, EF code first looks for a connection string that's named the same as the context. So if you were to put in a different connection string with that name, then it would use that instead. Alternatively, you could go into the context class and just start putting some custom logic of your own to describe how that should actually talk to a database.